Hello and welcome to My Friend the Rainbow Circle. Today I'm going to do a hot take think piece. That's kind of a tongue twister. On cats, of course. I haven't actually seen the Cats movie, but I don't tend to see movies until they're well out of the theater. So I thought I'd jump on the hot take think piece on cats before I've even seen it. But I wanted to talk instead about T.S. Eliot because that's a name that doesn't often come up anymore. Here's a cat. I thought I would have some cats around. As soon as I started talking about cats, there's another cat right over there. What did you think about Cats? I haven't seen it. I can't go to the theater. But anyway, T.S. Eliot is one of those names that will come up every once in a while if you're taking a literature class, or if somebody's talking about cats. People might say, well, this Cats movie is going to make T.S. Eliot roll over in his grave or whatever. And just full disclosure, I would prefer to have a million cats over T.S. Eliot, just personally. That's an opinion. Have no fondness personally for T.S. Eliot. But to look at it objectively, I mean, this sort of branches off of I'm just a jungle gym to her, apparently. This branches off of the episode that I just did about Westerns for whatever reason. Just pick a spot. Just pick a spot to stay. Okay. So the episode I did about Westerns, which is really just about testing different ways to assess the value of a particular text, what good and bad are, to refute some of the common ways that people determine good and bad. I don't want her to knock over all these books. This is turning into a cat's adventure inadvertently. Where are you going? What do you think is back there? Are you stuck? Are you stuck? Ah! Okay, cat's adventure. Okay, so anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. Okay, so T.S. Eliot is one of those writers who was dominant for a while, but has fallen out of favor, but really shaped how we think about literary analysis and the especially in the first half of the 20th century. But in the second half of the 20th century, I would argue, this gets into some real technical literature class type of things, but I would argue his importance was supplanted by William Carlos Williams in terms of influence on younger poetry generations. But one of the things that I talked about, you're just going to stay right there. Okay. She picked a spot, and it's just right in my face. Why don't you sit down? You can sit down. Sit down right there. There you go. Just sit down. One of the things I talked about in my arbitrary Western episode was the resurgence of biographical analysis, which is fascinating. And that's one of the things, that's part of the legacy of T.S. Eliot, is supplanting biographical analysis. That's why I say, I mentioned in that episode, biographical analysis is one of those things that was just refuted at the beginning of the 20th century, and nobody really has taken it very seriously up until recently, where it seems to be the only important thing that people talk about. But T.S. Eliot was responding to the whole idea that, like with Lord Byron is the prime example, let's assess Lord Byron's poetry based on just how lascivious he is and how much of a reprobate he is. That was the tendency. It's the new tendency these days, but it was the tendency, and T.S. Eliot was responding to that by saying, let's just look at the text itself. And, so that's sort of in a very, very simplified form, that was the origin of new criticism. And then new criticism gave way to, structuralism, post-structuralism, all that sort of stuff. Not to get too technical with all that. Okay, you gonna settle right there? Are you trying to get into that gap again? You're not going to fit in that gap. I know you're tiny, but you're not going to fit in that gap. So anyway, this is ironically a cat interrupting a discussion of Eliot's serious critical legacy. But Eliot himself, I mean, that's one of the issues with the legacy of Eliot. Don't knock that down, please. Okay. One of the issues of the legacy of Eliot is, things like his anti-Semitism and what have you. I mean, how are we to really? I mean, the resurgence of biographical criticism sort of undermines his legacy in many ways. Not that I think he really deserves a legacy, personally. But things like his anti-Semitism through, the resurgence of biographical criticism may put the nail in the coffin of his legacy for sure, arguably. This is interesting dynamic. Trying to keep my cat from knocking over. This is my son's hand. My son's hand. When he was only 4. I don't want you to knock that over. Oh, and here comes the dog. Yes, I've been talking about cats. I haven't even gotten to cats yet. Yes, hello. So interestingly, I mean, this is part of the irony of people saying, Eliot's gonna roll over in his grave because the new Cats movie. There you go. Okay. That somehow has become his legacy. I mean, that's the popularity of Cats. And Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats is such a random book in his collection of story. I mean, everything about cats is random. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing not random about cats. But in terms of Eliot's in terms of Eliot's output. Oh, okay, there we go. In terms of Eliot's output, what? Stop. Okay. Too many mammals. Okay, here we go. In terms of Eliot's output, it's kind of a random book. It's just a collection of kids' poems. Do you mind? Good Lord. Anyway, it's just a collection of these weird little kids' poems. Very, very different from The Wasteland, for example, or Four Quartets or something like that. And it was turned into a Broadway musical. Shut up! God, they just can't stop barking. Okay. That didn't muffle the noise all that much. Okay, so it was turned into a Broadway musical. One of the randomest of all Broadway musicals. Not really much of a plot. Do you want to go out? You can go out. You want to go bark too? Bo wants to go bark too. You want to go bark too? You can go bark too. Okay, so anyway. I think that more times I shoot these videos, the more often the animals just go crazy while I'm shooting them. They were kind of quiet just right before I started shooting this. All of the animals are going crazy. But anyway, so one of the randomest of all Broadway musicals, not much of a plot. Great Andrew Lloyd Webber songs, depending on how you feel about Andrew Lloyd Webber. But the actual development of the musical really had nothing to do with T.S. Eliot. It was just this kind of random book that he wrote. But I think a lot of the tarnish on his legacy is entirely justifiable based on other grounds. But I think also the problem with Eliot is he was pretty wrong about everything else. If you ask me, one of the things that I think is the most wrong is his idea of the objective correlative. Siku keeps barking at the cockatiel, and I'm just waiting for one of these days that birdcage to come falling down. Anyway, that's why I'm pausing and listening. Is the birdcage going to fall down? Okay, so anyway, Siku does not understand why a bird is inside of his house. So I'm trying to have a serious critical discussion of serious critical theory. But anyway, the objective correlative, I think, is an easy one to refute, but is the idea that um, a character's emotional responses need to match the circumstance. That's the really really basic definition of objective correlative, and he uses this to criticize Hamlet, and say he says Hamlet is bad because um, the way Hamlet responds does not match the circumstance. So, um, one really easy way to refute that is to say, just based on my principle, where the most important thing is visceral emotional response, right there. The core to any sort of everything else emanates from that. Um, so you could take anyone who genuinely loves Hamlet, which is plenty of people. You have plenty of people who say, well, it's not Shakespeare's best, but it's still pretty good. Um, you know, relatively small amount of people would say Hamlet is just out and out bad. Plenty of people say it's the greatest thing ever written. So they're wrong because of this concept Eliot had. Um, they're not allowed to enjoy it. I mean, I do love Hamlet. That's one of the easiest statements ever to make in assessment of a literary piece is to say, hey, you heard of the Hamlet thing? It is pretty good if you want to check it out. Okay. Hold on. Let me protect the poor bird. Were you trying to get the bird? Leave that bird alone. Leave that bird alone. I have a whole animal drama playing out in my house. So anyway, just anyone who with a genuine love of Hamlet has total validity in loving Hamlet. Anyone who dislikes Hamlet has total validity in disliking Hamlet. So here we go. So what TSO? Stop. That was not an invitation. Okay. God. All right. So what T.S. Eliot is saying, basically, stop. This is not a romance story where you can just kiss all up on my face. That's weird, you weirdo. Okay. Stop. No. Okay. So what Eliot is saying, this is a real simple point, and it's going to take me forever to make it because I have a dog trying to kiss my face right now. What Eliot is actually saying is, I do not like Hamlet, and that's that's essentially what he's saying. He's using the post-rationalization, which I think is one of the biggest obstacles. Now I have two mammals on my lap. Okay. One of the biggest obstacles in truly assessing a literary text is to recognize whether or not I am taking something that is just my opinion. I do not like Hamlet, for example, and trying to find some way to justify that as an objective opinion. The subjective correlative. It must be bad because the circumstances don't match his emotional responses. You can make that claim and have a greater recognition of your own opinion. So if you agree with Eliot, you can recognize this is how my personal opinion works. But it's not an objective assessment. And so you could pretty much look at any story, and you could see how well it's essentially a question of balance, and I think that's one of the stop. Bo's now eating the Little Women. Stop eating the Little Women. They have a movie coming out soon. They need to be ready for their movie. So you could assess how well the emotional responses are balanced with the circumstances of the story. And you can make an assessment like, this is a well-balanced story, but balance itself is not balance itself is not an objective measure. So, that's one of the problems with something like catharsis. Catharsis is so frequently interpreted as an objective measure. Was there a catharsis in the story? Is it a good story because it has a catharsis or what have you? But catharsis is essentially a way of restoring balance to a text. There's some unbalance, so there's some disruption of homeostasis. Catharsis returns homeostasis, but that's not something every story needs. Some stories need to be thrown off. Some stories need to be unbalanced. So if you look at something like Cats and you say, it's bad because it doesn't have a plot, it's just a bunch of characters telling their own stories. Could you take that and turn it into something objective and say all stories need a plot and all stories need to have something that ties the multiple character stories together? And there's sort of a loose plot with Cats. I mean, most of it has very little to do with T.S. Eliot, but there is kind of a loose plot with Cats. That's sort of the same basic principle of the objective correlative as a critique, is to say all stories need this particular balance. All stories need a plot. Well, that's just not true. What you're really saying is, I like a story with a plot. That's really all you're saying. I like a story with a catharsis. I like a story where the responses match the circumstances. And that's true with something like melodrama. I meant to mention this when I was talking about Wild Wild West, arbitrarily. Wild Wild West, if you compare the acting of Wild Wild West and Unforgiven, Unforgiven has much more of a naturalistic sort of acting approach. And that's something that, according to the audience, like Oscar voters, is more of a higher quality sort of acting. It's not really objectively a higher quality acting. That's sort of a 20th century concept that naturalistic acting is the only good kind of acting. Melodrama is a type of acting that is dismissed as objectively bad, but it's not objectively bad. It's just a different type of acting. And so, Wild Wild West is really over the top and unbalanced and crazy and wild. People will say, well, the acting is really bad. Well, it's not bad. It fits what it's supposed to be. It's an over-the-top movie with a giant mechanical spider. So are we expecting anything else to be naturalistic about it? No, of course not. It's hard to really turn that sort of thing into an actual objective measure. So to say, this is one reason I wanted to make sure to mention Hamlet. Because I think most people would probably say, your normal sort of people would normally say, Wild Wild West is bad and Cats is bad, so you must have no point at all. Sort of a reverse straw man. But I want to also mention the reason Cats refutes the objective correlative. Their really intense melodramatic emotions don't really. All Broadway musicals are like this, but the really intense melodramatic emotions don't really match the circumstances. They're really over the top compared to the circumstances. So T.S. Eliot would reject Cats based on that premise. But, if you do a reverse straw man, you would say, well, Cats is bad, therefore T.S. Eliot must be right. You would also be saying all Broadway musicals are bad. I entirely disagree. And that is a matter of taste. But I can understand that position. Don't agree with that position, but I understand that position. But I also want to mention Hamlet. That was the target that T.S. Eliot chose. He said Hamlet is really melodramatic as a character. Therefore, objective correlative is right. That's the easiest way to refute. You could pick thousands of things to refute the objective correlative. Beyond just Cats, but, Hamlet, might as well pick the thing that so many people point to as the greatest book of all time. That's the easiest way to refute it. Another interesting thing about the objective correlative, I did a presentation years ago using the X-Men to refute. I've used the X-Men to talk about story. X-Men is another one where people, will easily dismiss that as not worthy, of course. I personally disagree, of course. But I use the character Rogue. Rogue is one of my favorite characters of any medium. The way that she, Rogue's story highlights this multi-layering of experiences, which sort of, that's, I have a giant dog on my lap right now, but, so I can't lean forward too much. That's sort of how the rainbow circle works, is this layering spectrum. But one of the ways you can think about that, and the objective correlative, I think, is valuable in this way and this way alone. So I will reference it every once in a while. There is a resonance. I wouldn't say there needs to be a balance at all. Balance is an entirely irrelevant thing, just up to your taste. If you like balance, go for it. But there should be some sort of resonance between what's happening internally. No. What's happening internally and what's happening externally with a character. That's an important thing to really highlight and recognize. The correlative can be off balance. It's entirely fine if it's off balance. It's magnificent if it's off balance, if that's what the story needs. Oh, hold on. I don't need a dog in my face right now. I don't need a dog in my face. Okay. Sit down. Okay. Where was I? Now I have two dogs on my lap and fighting each other for the territory of my lap. Guys, can you just give me a minute? Can you just give me a minute? I don't need to love you all the time. There's my Broadway musical. My Broadway musical dogs. I don't need to love you all the time. Oh, God. Get out. 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 Get. God. Okay. My fault for letting them back in after they've been crazy. Where was I? This is happening more and more. Each of these videos, they go crazy. I kick them out. Anyway, they just knocked over my coffee cup. My, the places you'll go coffee cup. It did not break, thankfully. They did break. The cats broke a previous version of that same mug, and I had to get it again. So anyway, what was my point? So it's valuable to look at these multiple layers. Certainly, looking at how the external and the internal resonate with each other. But also, there's a third layer there, which is how it resonates with the reader. And so I never talk about level 5. Level 5 I find really uninteresting. Level 4, there's not that much you can do with it practically, but level 4 and level 5, that's sort of the resonance between level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Level 4, here we go. Level 4. Here we go. Okay. The height was readjusted against my will. And so I need to figure out a better place to put everything. There we go. Okay, level 4. Here's visceral stimulation, paradox, parataxis, one step of objectivity that creates this resonance, schematic, internal rule system, and the psychological. I don't really talk about the psychological. Psychological is not really the best name for it. I do need to find a better name. But it has entirely to do with that sort of resonance, that barrier between what's happening internally with the character, what's happening externally in the story world, but also how that resonates in the quote-unquote real world. That's sort of the barrier level, how all these things reflect and resonate with each other. Level 5 is so-called reality, which I think just in creating a text has some basic value. It's 5 levels of significance away from the core value. A lot of people put that as the only value, and it has some basic value. And I think the most practical value to really consider it is to look at that resonance. How does how does something happening internally with the character resonate with the external story condition? How does that resonate psychologically with the reader who's actually inside of the world? How does that reflect psychologically? How does that then reflect into the world itself? And you might consider it with things like research, what have you, historical accuracy, something ringing true to the real world. All that sort of stuff is essentially secondary to other considerations. But all of that resonates with each other, and that's sort of the idea. The significance of Rogue is that she has this permeable barrier between her internal and external world, so that shows how things flow from one to the other. But she's notorious, one of my favorite characters, but she's notorious for really, really melodramatic reactions, and really intensely emotional sort of reactions. But I think she's a really compelling character. Not to get off topic, but I think she's a really compelling character because she has a valid reason for it. I mean, you can look at that and say, that violates Eliot's subjective correlative concept. But she's pulling all these people's minds and souls and powers and lives into herself. So she's experiencing all of these lives. And so she, has everybody's emotions. This is certainly, you can look at this with any, more basically psychic characters in the X-Men universe. But I think what makes her compelling, this is why arguably I would put this as the second most important thing. Because if you look at any sort of compelling character, this is what tends to make them more compelling. There's the direct, visceral, empathetic, emotional response, but then there's the resistance to expressing that. The resistance to, that there's one of the ways this manifests is the resistance to expressing that. And so, if you look at Rogue, she has melodramatic emotional responses, but if you look at most of the time, she's holding all of that in. She's making sassy, sarcastic remarks openly and resisting the emotional response. But when she breaks, she tends to break pretty huge. And I think that's a much more compelling way of looking at Hamlet than to say that his circumstances don't really match his emotional responses. That seems like judgment on how teenagers react. He's a college student. Maybe he's 20, but college age people. That's a judgment on how college age people act. His father died. He should just get over it. How dare he have these intense emotional responses? So that's not really a practical sort of a measure of quality of a text that really acknowledges the variations in subjective responses to a text. Whereas if you looked at the paradox level, there you go. If you looked at level 2, you can look at how you can look at the contrast between Hamlet's public presentation and his private presentation. So what really makes him such a compelling character? The public face versus the private face, and that's all thematically tied up, just really intrinsically with who Hamlet is. So arguably an aspect of the character that you can look at much more compellingly is that he does feel all of these intense emotions. Whether the circumstances should lead to him feeling these intense emotions is really irrelevant. It's just the character, how the character feels. But what really helps him hit home is that he creates this public face to hide the intense emotions of the private face. Really famously, that's why that really defines Hamlet, as having these really intensely melodramatic, emotional speeches by himself, but then in the public putting on this wacky persona. That's a much, much, much more compelling sort of aspect to look at with any character, I think. it's more practical to work with as well. I mean, if you say objective correlative, and you say I have to balance every single character's emotional responses with the circumstances, that sounds like you're going to write a lot of really boring stories. Whereas if you look at the dynamic resonance that you can create by contrasting the public face and the private face, that's much more of a practical, lively, spirited sort of dynamic to really look at. And those can be radically unbalanced, and that lack of balance can create a lot of really intense energy with the story. But anyway, enough about that. Now that I've connected Hamlet, cats, and Rogue from the X-Men, I will see you on the next episode.